A friend messaged me this morning with a timely question. What are your thoughts on rioting from a biblical standpoint? I know many will inevitably say that rioting is not right and try to use the Bible to support their argument, but I feel like that's not historically supported. An example I think of is Jesus ransacking the temple market. Are there any other examples? I can't think of a more pertinent question for the time in which we are currently living, when the United States is full of people rising up once again to say no more to the brutal executions of black people by the police. And I agree with my friend that there are many who will inevitably point to Bible passages about the importance of peace or to Jesus' message to turn the other cheek, while ignoring the countless examples across the Bible of God demanding justice, God demanding that we do something when human beings are being exploited, oppressed, or murdered. I'm going to give examples of biblical events that we might call riots, or uprisings, or revolutions. And then I will look at some of those passages that could be used to condemn riots, such as the turn the other cheek one, or Jesus' own death on a cross. Finally, I will point out some things about the current protests going on in the United States that people of various opinions on riots should keep in mind. So let's get started with an example of something we might call a riot from the Book of Exodus. So most of us know the story of Exodus, right? That the people of God, the Israelites, were enslaved in Egypt and being subjected to brutal labor and cruelty. And they were crying out to God to save them, crying out to God for justice and an end to their oppression. And God hears their cry and calls upon Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him enough is enough, let the people go. So Moses does that, and he has help from his brother Aaron. And they speak together to Pharaoh about what's going on, and we know that Pharaoh doesn't listen to them. And so God has Moses unleash various plagues upon Egypt, the water into blood and the flies and the gnats, and livestock die and human beings die, and eventually every firstborn of Egypt dies. And so we see in this story an example of peaceful protest, right? Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh peacefully, using words to try and get Pharaoh to see reason. And it's only when Pharaoh will not listen that things get violent, which is something that I believe we can see happening at most, if not every protest right now, is that human beings show up because they don't have many other options for getting their voice out there. They're just trying to be heard when they say that Black Lives Matter and that, they would like police to stop killing people. And so they show up and they're using words, and then at some of these protests, things eventually escalate and become violent. And to continue this example from the Exodus story, we know that eventually Moses and Aaron and God win, that Pharaoh finally gives in after the death of these firstborn sons and says, okay, fine, take your people and get out of here. I don't want to see you anymore. And when the people win, when Moses tells all the Israelites to hurry up, gather up your stuff, we're getting out of here today, Exodus 12:33 through 36 tells us that not only do the Israelites sort of get liberated and head out from Egypt, but they also plunder the Egyptians. It says that the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the land because they thought, we'll all be dead. But before the Israelites left, they did as Moses told them and asked the Egyptians for their silver and gold jewelry as well as their clothing. The Lord made sure that the Egyptians were kind to the people, so that they let them have whatever they asked for. And so they plundered the Egyptians. And I just, think that in this time when people are pointing to the looting that is happening during some of these protests turned into riots, if we want to call them that, we see here in the Bible an example of looting, of plundering that is sort of, God condoned. And I'm not saying that there are exact parallels, and I'm also, I'm just offering food for thought without going into too much detail yet. I'll try to include links more about the looting that we're seeing in our current day. But I do think that this example in Exodus is really interesting because we can call it plundering the Egyptians, we can call it looting, or maybe we could think of it as reparations. Many Black and Indigenous people and movements in the United States and elsewhere in the world are calling for reparations for the centuries of harm done to their communities. And so when they sort of seize what is theirs, what rightly belongs to them, do we always think of it as looting, or could we see it in some cases as reparations? But yeah, so in Exodus we have this story of a riot against the Egyptians that is enacted by God, right? We have this divine riot of plagues when the powers that be won't hear words and will only respond to rioting. And it works. Though we also see in the book of Exodus that the riot, this divine riot against the Egyptians, doesn't turn out to be enough. It helps. It gets the people free, but it doesn't solve all of their problems. We know how the story goes, right? Pharaoh lets them go. He responds to the riots by letting the people go, and then he changes his mind, and he uses his armies to attack again and to try and wipe out the people. But God drops the entire Red Sea down on Pharaoh and his armies and wipes them out. And so to me, I think this is a word for people on any side of this opinion about protests and riots, is that it turns out that there's no way to truly end state violence for good without destroying the tools of state violence. Pharaoh's army was always going to attack again unless it could be completely removed from the picture. And so I feel that way about the riots today and the protests today, the peaceful ones and the ones that turn violent, is that ultimately we must disband the tools of state violence, which is our police forces and our excessive military. Let's move on to another example in Scripture of something that we might call a riot. And this time it's in the Book of Esther. Basically, Esther is a Jewish woman living in another time in Israel and Judah's history where foreign empires have come and taken over and conquered the people, and so they're living as a marginalized and colonized people. Esther sort of does not divulge the fact that she's Jewish to the king, this emperor, who takes her as his new queen, but she still lives in this fear of violence. One, if it's revealed that she's a Jew, it turns out that the king is allowing Haman Haman gets an edict from the king to kill all Jews on a certain day. That on a certain day, all of the king's people are going to rise up against the smaller numbers of Jews in their midst and wipe them all out. And so, of course, Esther is terrified about this because that's her people. And she also has to face fear the violence of what could happen if she tries to talk to the king when he's not willing to listen. If she enters his presence without his permission, he can execute her. But she does it anyway. And so she faces her fears and faces the king who has the power to execute her. It actually works for her. This is an example of a peaceful protest where Esther only uses words and the king listens. The powers that be listen. And wouldn't that be wonderful if in these examples in the United States of protests, the powers that be actually listened so that protests didn't escalate into violence because the people were heard. As Martin Luther King Jr. says, riots are the voice, the language of the unheard. And so in this example, we've got Esther managing to just use words to sway the king. And so the king actually hands over a significant amount of his power over to Esther and to her relative Mordecai. So the king says, oh, shoot, yeah, I don't want to kill your people. Here's the power you need in order to protect your people. I'm not going to sort of control the situation instead of letting you do it yourselves. And so he hands the power over to actual Jews, and they determine that the only way they can protect their people from this looming violence that has been enabled by the state is to equip the marginalized Jews to fight back against it. They find that they are not able to stop the tide of state-sanctioned violence about to crash down upon their people. So instead, they give their people weapons with which to fight back. And I think this is the part of the story that most sort of children's picture book Bibles and videos, they stop the story of Esther before this part happens, which is that in chapter 8, verse 11, the Jews were free to wipe out, kill, and destroy every army of any people and province that attacked them, including women and children. They could also take and keep anything their attackers owned. So again, we have a story where it turns out that words were not enough, that violence is something that the people use in order to stop themselves from being killed. That's all they want. They just don't want to be killed. That's all. And in this case, they find that they have to fight back with violence in order to protect themselves and to survive. And we also have this example again, sort of something we might call looting, that they can take and keep anything their attackers owned. And again, what if we thought of that more as reparations than as looting, where this colonized and conquered people who have been oppressed in the state in which they live take back what perhaps they are owed after all of this oppression. So those are the two main examples I'll share of sort of these divine riots. Some other examples include the protests of the prophets. From Ezekiel to Micah to John the Baptist, we see prophets instructed by God to go and yell at their kings and other leaders. And these prophets often use really strong language that you could say were very much capable of inciting violence, just as we do sometimes see protesters yelling at the police. You will find that often protesters are doing their best to maintain the peace, but you will hear some stronger language and demands that, we could point to and say, well, look, they're inciting the violence with their words. But that's what we see from the biblical prophets, right? They felt compelled by their God to speak. They would have their little protest of one and often call on the people to also join in on that protest. So now let's move on to Jesus. First off, while I can't think of any examples of Jesus sort of partaking in a riot himself, unless we look again, my friend did mention the time that he is said to have gone into the temple and upended all the money changers' tables. Other than that, it's hard to sort of point to a time when he incited a riot or was part of a riot. In fact, on the night of his arrest, he prevents one of his followers from inciting such a thing by yelling at the disciple who cuts off a Roman soldier's ear. And yet, we see that Jesus definitely was not above using violence-inciting language. Like so many of the prophets in the Bible, Jesus frequently argued with his fellow Jewish religious leaders, and he would sometimes get pretty rude towards them, and say some pretty some nasty things against them. And then there is one time when Jesus very nearly did instigate something that we could interpret as a riot. Let me set the scene. This is the Palm Sunday reading in church tradition, where Jesus enters Jerusalem for Passover, and we know that a few days after he enters, he's going to get arrested and crucified. So that's the scene we're in. And what Jesus decides for his entrance into Jerusalem, he's going to stage this demonstration where he marches in on 2 donkeys, and he's going to have crowds shout, "Hosanna, save us, Son of David." This is extremely incendiary language. It's a threat against the Roman Empire that has colonized Jerusalem at this point. He is invoking stories from his Jewish scriptures, hailing a Messiah who will retake Jerusalem. Centuries before Jesus does this, David is the one who won Jerusalem for Israel. And now, in Roman eyes, it definitely looks like Jesus is claiming he's about to do the same thing again. He's going to win control of Jerusalem over from the Romans and for the Jews. So it's dangerous to empire what he's doing. And in Matthew 21:10, we see that the people of Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, is stirred up by Jesus' actions. They're shaken up, they're rocked by what he's doing, the implications that he's a successor of David, and that he might be planning on sort of starting a riot. And so, yeah, the people are shaken up. And so we see that Jesus doesn't seem to be condemning that. He must certainly be aware that that is a possible consequence of his behavior marching in like this. And some of his fellow Jewish religious leaders are afraid of what he could potentially incite, because they know that their people don't have the power to stand up against the Roman Empire. That if a riot starts, Rome will not hesitate to kill anyone involved, and potentially innocent bystanders can get hurt too. Again, I want to be careful here and remind you that we can get into dangerous anti-Semitic territory when we talk about the scribes and the Pharisees plotting to kill Jesus. So I just want to say, remember, it is the Roman Empire that executes Jesus, not the Jews, not the Jewish leaders. Many of Jesus's fellow religious leaders feared Rome, and that's understandable. Like I said, Jesus's staged protest could have led to a riot that would have been very dangerous for his fellow Jews. Not because the rioters would have been doing something wrong by demanding justice against Rome or liberation, but because Rome's response would be violent. Rome is the bad guy here. Not Jesus with his protest, not the people who may want to riot, not even the people who are scared of the consequences of the riot. No, Rome is the one with the actual power in this situation, the power to turn a rightful demand for liberation and justice into a violent quashing that has unfortunate consequences, just like innocent store owners and their workers have in some cases been harmed by the protests going on right now. Though I will include some links to examples of movements who are involved with the protests raising funds for some of the small businesses who have been impacted by some of these protests. But yeah, so we've made it to my last biblical example of this video, and that is the crucifixion of Jesus. And I'm also going to look back at his instruction to turn the other cheek. To many of us, especially those who are white like me, or otherwise privileged enough that we can ignore the state violence enacted against our neighbors, many of us misuse Jesus' message of turning the other cheek to claim that those who are being oppressed, exploited, or even murdered should just act like doormats, should just passively receive the violence and never fight back. Many also look at Jesus' own execution at the hands of a colonizing state and say, hey, look, Jesus went willingly to his execution, and in doing so, he saved all of us from our sins. It was a sacrifice. And it shows that if we respond to violence with peace, by which we mean passivity, we will be rewarded in heaven too. How dare we? How dare we look at Jesus' broken body on the cross and to look at his loved ones who are broken and scattered and grieving and traumatized by his death and say that we just have to accept it when beloved children of God in our midst are subjected to the same things today. No. Allowing this thing to happen again and again and again, it's wrong. Dolores Williams was a Black womanist theologian who took Christian academia by storm when she proclaimed that interpreting the crucifixion as something we should emulate in our own lives does infinite harm to Black women and to others who are marginalized and oppressed in our societies. Because it means that when Black women are abused by their communities or expected to sacrifice their every dream and all of their time and energy for the men in their lives, they're told that it makes them a good Christian. And any attempts at their part to sort of grasp at Jesus' abundant life for themselves gets shut down because they're not taking up their cross like Jesus says to do. Dolores Williams says that Black women cannot forget the cross, but neither can they glorify it. To do so is to glorify suffering and to render their exploitation sacred. To do so is to glorify the sin of defilement. So let's not use the fact that Jesus allowed himself to be led off to his torture and execution as an excuse to allow the same thing to happen to human beings today. There is nothing salvific about Black bodies being abused and shot down in the streets. There is nothing holy in Black communities torn apart by grief and trauma and fear. But there is something holy when they, and we who follow them, speak out against the horrors done to them. Is that not why Jesus' followers spread the news about what happened on the cross everywhere that they could? Why Paul constantly proclaimed Christ crucified? Because speaking of this state-sanctioned execution that failed was a protest against those violent powers. In dying on the cross, Jesus identified himself with every single human being who has been or is or will be tortured by governmental powers. It was an ultimate act of solidarity for God to die in this way. For the Roman state, killing God exposed for everyone to see the evil of their violence and the absurdity of their belief that violence equals power. That is the actual message behind Jesus' instruction to turn the other cheek, in fact. And I have a video that goes into greater detail about sort of the cultural things that Jesus was saying here, so I'll link that. But basically, he was saying, if someone whom society gives power over you, like a Roman soldier, strikes you, then you can expose their violence for the evil it is by saying, fine, hit me again. You are the one doing it, but it's on my terms because I want to show everyone how evil you are. So go on, do it, hit me again, or don't, and prove that you know that striking me is about maintaining your control, but that I'm actually your equal. And to know that even when I don't have the power that you have, I don't have the power to strike back, I always have the power to expose your evil. I see the exposing of that evil when marginalized communities gather in protest. When they bring cardboard signs and nothing but their voices to a rally, and the state brings riot gear and tear gas and rubber bullets in response, these protesters don't want to get hurt, but they accept that it is a possibility when standing up against a violent power. For those Christians who are so eager to have everyone turn the other cheek, I invite you to look at these protesters who stand strong and defenseless, with their eyes open to the threat of tear gas and their bodies open to the threat of rubber bullets. I return to the crucifixion, Jesus' rebellion against state powers that could easily quash any riot that his oppressed people might attempt. And I say again that his death on the cross was an act of solidarity with those black and brown bodies, male and female, cisgender and transgender, that bloodied the hands of the United States police and military. And I don't come up with this idea on my own, let me tell you. I defer to Black theologian James Cone, who wrote, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation, the cross, has been detached from any reference to the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings. Those whom Ignacio Ellacuría, the Salvadoran martyr, called the crucified peoples of history. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. On the cross, Jesus aligns himself with those tortured by their governments in 20th century Latin America, with indigenous peoples across the world who have been colonized by governments that then fail to protect them from poverty or illness or starvation or violence, with black persons lynched by white civilians and shot by police officers who decide to take the law into their own hands and face very few consequences for doing so. But not only does Jesus' crucifixion expose the violence and place him among the ranks of others killed, there's also a message of good news for all victims of such violence in his death. Because Jesus didn't stay dead, right? He rose back to life. The state wanted to punish him for getting uppity against them, wanted to erase him and all that he stood for, wanted to make those who might follow after him too afraid and traumatized to do so. But they failed. he rose again, proving that God's power of compassion and life will ultimately triumph over their power of violence and death. That is why people protest today. When black and brown bodies, mentally ill or disabled bodies, or transgender bodies are murdered with impunity by state forces. It's to say, you killed them, but we refuse to let them die. We will say their names. Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade. We will say their names because the powers that be don't want us to. We will say their names and we will demand for Black lives to matter because they matter to God. I'm going to close with one more facet of Jesus' death and resurrection story and interweave it with a question for those of us who are witnessing police brutality and protests going on today. Here's the question. When the news comes out about these protests turned violent, whose voices do you listen to? Whom do you believe? If you were a disciple who witnessed Jesus' empty tomb, whom would you believe? Would you believe the ones who proclaimed that angels appeared and told them that Jesus had risen? Would you believe the women who proclaimed that they saw Jesus in the flesh? Or would you believe rumors that Roman soldiers stole his body away in the night? Would you believe that Jesus was still dead, that the empire had won? So now, today, when protesters are sharing their videos and stories about what they see taking place at these riots that turn violent, do you watch their videos? Do you listen to their stories? Do you believe them when they say that the violence was instigated by someone planted in their crowd, while most of the protesters were trying to keep things peaceful? Do you believe them when their videos show that police used tear gas and rubber bullets before the looting at the Target happened? That the white woman who posted herself at Target's doors was stabbing them with a knife before they moved her out of the way? And when they say that they did not attack her or beat her up in response, but did just try to get the knife away from her and move her? Or do you believe the police, the voice of the state, when they claim that the protesters are the ones who escalated things? Do you listen only to their side of things, rely on news sources that interview them, and deny platform to protesters? Whom do you believe, and why? And finally, those of you who condemn protests that transform into riots, I wonder, why don't you do your part to help keep those protests peaceful? Why don't you educate yourself on how to prepare for a protest, for what white bodies in particular can do at protests to help keep them from escalating into violence, such as using our bodies to shield protesters of color, or telling other white protesters in the crowd to shut up if they start trying to instigate something, if they start yelling at police. If you are like the disciple Thomas, who needed to see and touch Jesus himself in order to believe that the empire had lost, that's fine. But why don't you go and see for yourself? Educate yourself first, because I don't want you going there uneducated and instigating something that's going to hurt the black and brown protesters who are there with you. But educate yourself and then go and see what you notice about who starts the violence and who tries to keep things from escalating, about who is doing the looting and who is starting the fires and why. That's all I've got for you today, except to say that Black lives matter. Black lives matter to God. Black lives must matter to those of us who claim to follow Jesus, who was executed at the hands of a violent colonialist state. Keep yourselves safe, my friends, and let us all together do what we can to bring God's justice into the world.